In part 1 of the subprocesses videos, you've seen how you can take a massive business process and cut it down into pieces, put them in a nice hierarchy, and then you have a very smooth and nice business process. Much smaller, much more easier to understand than these massive business processes. Today, in this video, we're going to look at how we can use these subprocesses to further use. We're going to see how we can loop them, how we can put things in parallel, and a few others. So let's put these subprocesses to a bit more use rather than cleaning up the model. First up is loops. So sometimes we want to redo something while a certain condition holds. So, for example, here we have a process that shows how Beamte answer ministerial responses. And we see that there is a loop here. In this loop, we have to prepare a ministerial response, that's the first activity, and the second one, review the ministerial response. And if the minister isn't happy, we go back into the loop and we do everything again. Now, yeah, okay, this is possible, but can we make this a bit more elegant? We can, with the loop marker. This is what it looks like. There is a little loop icon in the bottom center of a loop task, and that means that that activity is repeated. The same for a loop subprocess. We put this loop marker next to the little plus for the subprocess, and this is a collapsed loop subprocess. We can also do this for expanded subprocesses, and then it looks like this. Now, in BPMN, which is XML based, the condition where to stop or not is of course there, but there is no way in the BPMN language to show that. So to do that, we use as a convention that we put a text annotation indicating the condition for repetition, so when we should do another loop, and the maximum number of repetitions. So we say, okay, after 5 times, yeah, don't bother, we stop. That you can also do. So in our example, we can summarize it as follows. So this part is summarized into a collapsed business process, which has a corresponding expanded business subprocess here. And based on this loop indicator, we know that this finalized ministerial response is going to be repeated. And when is it repeated? That's in this text annotation, when the response is not approved. That is the loop. Next, what if we need to execute multiple instances of that subprocess in parallel? So, as an example, say that I am grading an exam, and I'm, let's assume this is parallel, that I work on them in a certain order. For instance, first question 1 of every one, and then question 2. So I have different exam papers that I need to grade. I can model it like this, using 2 parallel gateways, one split, one join, and then 5 or however many exam papers I have to grade times this grade. It works, but elegant? No. Imagine that I have to do this n times. So let's say that is not 5 but 200. Then am I going to put 200 of these great things into my model? Well, probably not. And this number 200 is not fixed anyway. So yeah, it's, do I need to OR join and instead, let's use multi-instance. Because this entire model with its 200 or n grading subprocesses, I can replace with one subprocess. In order to do that, I use the multi-instance marker, which says that I start multiple instances of that activity in parallel. So for a task, it looks like this. For a multi-instance subprocess, it looks like this. So we put the little multi-instance marker, which is through 3 vertical lines next to the subprocess marker. And of course, the expanded multi-instance also has these little markers. Now, again, behind the scenes, in the XML shape of a BPMN model, there is something that tells us how many times we need to do this. But we don't see XML. We don't want to see XML in when we're modeling. You know, that's not a communication tool. It's for people. That's a communication tool for computers. So again, we have a convention that we add a text annotation that says how many times we need to do this. So back to our example, this very inelegant model and unmaintainable as well, we can just summarize with one subprocess grade, and we make it multi-instance. And then by convention in the text annotation, we say that we have, in this case, 20 exam papers. So that means that we execute this grade for 20 exam papers in parallel. Now, much more elegant, right? Now, if you've already watched the video on data, you have seen that we have data collections. We can also use them here. So using a collection of exam papers, I can use those that collection as exam papers as kind of to indicate how many times I need to grade things. So this magically maps up. So this multi-instance marker and this multi-instance marker actually are connected. So precisely for each exam paper, one grading subprocess is started, and all of them in parallel. Now that's truly dynamic, right? I don't need to denote this 20 anymore. I can just make sure that I have a collection of data objects, and then everything will be all right. Another example where you can use multi-instance is if you have an insurance claim process where you have to contact witnesses. After a car crash, sometimes an insurance company may ask you, like, hey, there were witnesses there and you wrote down their names. Can you please send them this form to fill in to tell us what happened? Now, if you denoted a number of witnesses and you want to send them a form, that's a very nice example of where you can use multi-instance, because you don't want to model like, we have 7 witnesses. You want to do that with the multi-instance subprocess. Next is the ad hoc subprocess. Sometimes we just don't want to model everything. Like here we have in business processes, what we've done up to now is very structured. So it says you precisely when to do what. But what if we don't want to model it in that level of detail? So then we can use an ad hoc subprocess. So these do not come as tasks, but only as subprocesses. And they look as we expect, except for the expanded ad hoc subprocess. You see here I have an A and a B within my expanded ad hoc subprocess, and based on this ad hoc marker, this tells me that any number of times I want, I can execute any activity within this expanded ad hoc subprocess. So you see it tells me which activities I have to execute, don't even have to, which activities I can execute, namely A and B in this example, but it doesn't tell me in what order, and it doesn't tell me how often. So it doesn't tell me anything around how many times I should execute them. I can add things like sequence flows and data and gateways. Yes, I can do that. So it is not really restricting. The only thing I cannot put in an ad hoc subprocess is a start and end event. So these are not allowed in ad hoc subprocesses. And they don't make sense because the whole purpose of an ad hoc subprocess is that I can execute everything at will, or maybe add a few constraints. Let's look at an example. Here we have a subprocess about writing a book chapter. Now, the first thing to note is that I am writing multiple chapters at the same time. So this is a multi-instance subprocess. So I'm writing multiple chapters at the same time. Now, writing, if you've ever done it, you know that is not really a business process. That goes everywhere. You go do that, and then you think, oh, that looks interesting, should find out more about it, and then you think, oh, hold on, and then that has implications here, so you write a bit. So it's very chaotic. So that's why we use this multi-instance marker, ad hoc marker. That tells us that anything within this subprocess can be executed at will. So I can start with organized references. Then halfway doing that, I can go to finalize the chapter, and then realize, oh, I'm not done yet. I need to go back to write text and go with that. So all of that is captured here. It allows for any such behavior. Here is again the multi-instance marker, so generate graphics. What this multi-instance marker tells me is that this task of generate graphics is executed multiple times in parallel. And in this case, that means that there are multiple graphics that I can work on in parallel, or somebody else could work on them. Similarly, we have include graphics in text. That is also multi-instance. So for each, I would imagine for each graphic, it needs to be placed in the text. Then here we have the loop, which tells me that writing or editing text is repeated. So we do that over and over, but not in parallel. So just after one another. This is a very unstructured process, and hence the term ad hoc. But even in an ad hoc process, we can add constraints. So for instance, this is the same activities, but here there are some constraints added and data objects. So for instance, we see that in order to do finalized chapter, we need to, by this sequence flow, have done organized references first. And similarly, if we do organized references, then we have to do finalized chapter. It still doesn't say how often, but just says that there is a constraint there. Similarly, generate graphics should be done before we include the graphics in the text. And notice that this arc says that all graphics need to be ready before they can be put in before all of them together can be put in the text. Then we can start over with the graphics, but they all need to be done before you can include them. That's what that constraint says. The data adds further constraints. So for instance, here we see that the graphics are required by generate graphics and then produced. Let's try that again. We see that this constraint is also expressed in the data perspective. We see that generate graphics, actually the output of it is graphics, And the input of include graphics in text is also the graphics. All of them interact with the chapter text. So we see by means of data and by sequence flows, we can impose some structure on this process, but make no mistake, this is still very, very unstructured. Let's wrap up with an overview of the markers we've seen, and one that is still coming up in another video. For tasks, we can use the multi-instance marker, the loop marker, and the compensation marker. And the compensation marker will be shown in another video. For subprocesses, we can use the marker multi-instance, loop, compensation, and ad hoc. Notice that we cannot combine the markers multi-instance and loop. That wouldn't make sense together. Do something in parallel and looping, no. So you cannot combine them. This wraps up this two-part video series on subprocesses. We started in part 1 with why you would want to use subprocesses, and it is to decompose processes into smaller parts such that they become more readable and more maintainable. We can do that using subprocesses, and subprocesses are activities that contain a subprocess in themselves. Using these, you can form a hierarchy of processes and thereby abstract from details that you do not want to see in higher levels. We saw how to use subprocesses and to reuse them using the call activities. These are comparable to, in programming, named functions. So you define them once and you can use them everywhere. Now, in the second part, we've seen some goodies or freebies that come kind of for free with these subprocesses, namely the loop, that you can repeat a subprocess until a certain condition doesn't hold anymore. We have seen the multi-instance marker, which tells us that the subprocess is to be executed multiple times, but in parallel, so at the same time, and that subprocess then finishes only when all of these instances are done. And we've seen the ad hoc subprocess marker, which tells us which activities can be executed as part of that ad hoc subprocess, but it doesn't tell us how often and in what order.